Okay, well, good to have you all back here for another episode of Christianity versus Capitalism. Those of you who have made everyone are doing pretty well, I reckon, to hang in so far. So today the subject matter moves on, and we go into the big question of capitalism and well-being. And so the big issue we're talking about is the impact of a capitalist world system on people's lives, really. That's the story we're wanting to get at. What does it meant for humans? And so we're thinking about those big words of poverty, inequality, and standards of living. I have to say, I'm a little bit nervous about tonight because there is just so much to say. And I realized in the preparation of this stuff that actually I feel like I've got a lot invested in this story, because something I've spent a lot of time in, and I'm trying to it's a very big story, and trying to tell it right, I feel a bit nervous about. And I think the reality is, well, there's no right telling. I can only do what we can do within our time allotted. We're not going to get to all of so we'll talk about poverty and standards of living, but we won't really get to talk about inequality. There's a lot we won't get to talk about. But hopefully at least we'll get a good entry into looking at this question. So to just position where we are in our series, so we've spent a bit of time thinking about what is capitalism, both historically and theologically, and where it came from, its relationship to Christianity. And so tonight we're thinking about how we account for its human impact in the world, how we understand that story, because really how we understand that story, which the story we associate with capitalism has very strong moral implications. And so that's critical, how we understand that story. And then that sort of sets the background for how we think about next week. We start to get into the much more nitty-gritty questions of, for those of us who are following Jesus, what it means to try and follow Jesus in the world of capitalism, and how we witness to Christ in this world. So in this episode, we're really going to be focusing on historical stuff and lots of numbers and stuff. We'll get to some, very briefly, some theological concepts, but we're really going to be looking at the world of history and what's happening, and particularly in social and economic history. Firstly, as we've done each night, just reminding what we mean by capitalism in this series. So we're talking about capitalism as a world system. We're not using the word capitalism merely as a synonym for either commerce or profit making or markets economies, not to mean a mode of production like industrialization, and neither just to mean some sort of economic ideology like neoliberalism. Rather, when we're using the word capitalism, we're mostly talking about an economic system that is defined by endless accumulation and relentless commodification. And the history of the capitalist world system that we've told is a system that began as an interstate economic system that began in Europe in the long 16th century. That's roughly between 1450 and 1650, and gradually expanded to displace all other world systems and economic systems by the mid-19th century. So we're going to be really sort of tracing again that history tonight, but really paying attention to its social and economic consequences. So it's no secret, I've been pretty clear. I've been talking about capitalism and the capitalist world system in quite strongly negative terms, and that became very clear with the night we talked about a theological language for thinking about capitalism. But of course, there's lots of people who want to defend capitalism across who occupy a spectrum of views, really. And there is a very strong moral narrative that supports capitalism and its history. both amongst those who it's cheerleaders, but even amongst those who are much more ambivalent about it, but actually feel it's there's something that we can't ignore. And it runs something like this. I'll put a few quotes up here. So this is John Atherton, an English theologian who wrote a book, Transfiguring Capitalism. He wrote, "The last 200 years, and particularly since 1945, have witnessed an outburst of economic achievements which has enabled human well-being to begin to make the historic transition from absolute want to astonishing levels of wealth, education, and income. The transformation of individual and social well-being since 1750 represents one of the decisive changes in human history." So that's a big statement. He's saying this is to do with human well-being and a decisive change in human history. So that means something morally. And let's just note something about what he said there. Transformation of well-being since 1750. We'll just note that in your minds as we come and tell our story tonight. Here's another quote from the American economist Deirdre McCloskey, who's very widely read and quite influential, from her essay, The Great Enrichment, which sort of gives the clue away how she thinks about capitalism. From 1800 to the present, the average person on the planet has been enriched in real terms by a factor of 10, or some 900%, in the ever-rising share of places from Belgium to Botswana and now in China and India that have agreed to the bourgeois deal, which is let me earn profits from creative destruction in the first act, and by the third act, I will make all of you rich. The factor is 30 in conventional terms, and if allowing for improved quality of goods and services, such as improved glass and autos or improved medicine and higher education, a factor of 100. We're 100 times better off than we were in 1800. And it's Deirdre McCloskey is unequivocal. This is a moral good that is unchallengeable that capitalism has brought us. Let's just note in the quote here that the little let me earn profits in the first act from creative distraction, and by the third act, I'll make you all rich. We'll come back to that one again later tonight. Here's a much more, I think, measured comment by, I think, Miroslav Volf, a more thoughtful theologian, and he's responding to a book written by Daniel Bell in the journal Modern Theology. Volf writes, "This is the hour of capitalism's triumph, and it is now that capitalism most needs a critique. Still, it is extraordinary that Bell, in his book, does not have a single positive thing to say about present-day market economies. Bell is wrong, I think, in reading capitalism only in negative terms. For all its grave inadequacies, including a trail of tears in its wake, capitalism is also helping feed and make life easier for the great majority of the world's population." So I think many of you would recognize and that's a more measured statement from Miroslav Volf, there's a lot of people who share this ambivalence about capitalism, recognizing that there's something quite problematic to be critiqued in it. And yet, how do you account for that it seems to be an economic system that works incredibly well and therefore must be doing some good? Let's just note in this quote, though, that Miroslav Volf, contrary to what we've been doing, is making a strong correlation between capitalism and the market economy. So when he says it's helping feed and make life easier for the great majority of the world's population, we're left asking, well, what's doing the work there? Is it capitalism or is it market economies? For him, they're the same thing, but we can make a conceptual distinction between those things. Of course, there's a strong counter-argument. There's been as I pointed out, I think it was in our last session, there's been a long history of critique of capitalism. This is from Immanuel Wallerstein, one of the academics who developed world systems theory that we've been using. He writes that capitalism overall has been more exploitative, that is extractive of surplus labor, and destructive of life and land for the vast majority of persons, located within the boundaries of the world economy than any previous mode of production in world history. So we've got very strong divergence in views between Immanuel Wallerstein and Deirdre McCloskey. They're both reading the same history. They're both incredibly well read. How do we account for this? Okay, well, of course, we're not going to be able to answer all of these questions tonight, but here's how I'm going to approach these questions. So here's our basic question that we're considering. Are people better or worse off under capitalism? Seems like a pretty simple question. Are they better or worse off? But actually, it's a very fraught question. What do we mean by better or worse off? And so that means we need to ask lots of questions by things like, what do we mean by the word poverty? Seems like a simple word. We think we know what we mean. But the more you start to probe the word, the more problematic it begins. So for me, when I think about poverty, we're talking about lots of things. We're talking about a material standard of living. We're also maybe thinking about the conditions of labor that you need to live. We're talking about the extent of your dependence on others or your independence, or we might use a word like freedom, your social status, and a big word, well-being. That's already been invoked by a couple of our authors tonight. What do we mean by well-being? So people mean different things. So for me tonight, well-being can't mean anything unless we're talking about the whole human. That requires thinking about physical, mental, social, cultural, political, and ecological. I think that's theologically, that's the only way to think about well-being. I'm missing spiritual there too. We're thinking theologically, that's the obvious missing one there. And then when we think about questions like poverty and inequality, how do we measure things like that? Do we measure income? That's a more complex concept than you think. Are we talking about aggregates and averages, or are we talking about within countries or between countries? And then how do we evaluate inequality? Is inequality a good or bad thing? There's different views on that. And most people would say some inequality is necessary, but too much is bad. But how much is too much? We're actually not going to get to talk a lot about inequality, but all of these questions basically underpin these sort of the moral questions we're going to be arguing about capitalism history. And they're not simple questions. I just want to give you a sense that these are actually really difficult questions to, if you're looking for some sort of proof of some sort of case, then the complexity of the case you have to make is so great, it makes anything like a proof seem impossible. There's some more methodological considerations we want to take into account, and particularly from the way I've been talking about capitalism. One of the core ones that world systems theory gives us is a unit of analysis to work with. And that is that the unit of analysis, the thing that we're looking at, is not nations to start with, or not the nation, but the world system. So we're looking at an economic system as a whole. What do I mean by that? So that means, so what you'll see quite commonly in a lot of academic literature that's discussing capitalism, whether it's been good or bad, is they'll point to, well, let's say Dutch laborers in the 17th century in capitalist Holland were clearly a lot better off in their quality of life from Polish serfs in feudal Poland in the 17th century. So capitalist Holland, people were better off. Feudal Poland, agrarian, they're a lot worse off. So that seems a simple way of comparing whether capitalism is better. And that's probably the dominant way it's been done in a lot of literature. But actually, as we'll actually come to this very case later on tonight, turns out that the Dutch laborers and the Polish serfs were all part of the same world system in the 17th century. So you can't compare them against each other, because they're each the situation of the Dutch laborers is related to the situation of the Polish serfs. We'll talk about that. Means our question about how we think about all of these questions has to be answered historically. That's through progressing through time and within a bigger context as we can give it. And it has to be done analytically. That's making distinctions between the things that we need to, as I've done, between what our unit of analysis is, making distinctions about whether we're talking about market economies or capitalism, things like that. So in this telling the historical story, empirical data is very important, but is also often problematic. Empirical data, as you'll see, economic, and it will mostly be economic data, can be as misleading as it can be informative if we don't place it, if we don't understand the historical context it fits into and the story it tells within a broader historical context. Often it tells us a misleading story if we don't place it in its proper context. Another really tricky question is how do we separate the influence of the capitalist system from the general background of human technological and material advance? So during the period that we're looking at, the 500 years in which capitalism has been, a capitalist world system has been in existence, humans' technological advance has been staggering, and a lot of that we would just naturally attribute to capitalism, and that's true to some level, but not entirely. So, for example, in the 18th century, across the board in Eurasia, and I think in many parts of Africa too, there was a widespread growth in human populations. And for the first time in human history, there were advances in agriculture that allowed those populations to keep growing rather than collapse as they had done previously once they reached a certain, what's called a Malthusian limit. So there was some sort of improvement in economic forms that happened across the board in capitalist societies, but also outside of the capitalist world system. So this is, we're talking about the 18th century. China and India were still outside of the capitalist world system. This happened across the board. It was a human thing. And so how do we read the advances that capitalism may have brought as against this broader background of technological change? How do we distinguish between them? It's very hard. Similarly, how do we separate out the influence of the capitalist system from the general operation of commerce and markets, as in that Miroslav Volf question? I'm not going to try and do any of this in a fine-combed way tonight, but I'm merely pointing out that there's some really thorny questions, and in terms of answering these questions, getting at our question tonight. So what that means for my argument tonight is essentially this. The history of the capitalist world system is mixed up with a bunch of stuff, including what I'm going to call, this is theological language, the providential structures of government and exchange, things which humans need and are good for them. And it's impossible to disengage the capitalist world system from these things. They're all mixed up together. So the answers to our question tonight can only be suggestive answers. We can't come to any proof. Really, my key interest tonight is to provide a challenge to the very simplistic assumptions and the story of the moral narrative of capitalism that we've heard before, because it is very challengeable. I hope you'll see. This is my basic contention, and I've framed it in theological language to make very clear the sort of moral framework by which I'm coming from in telling the story of capitalism. And that's simply that the capitalist world system is a lordless power. You'll need to go back to episode 2, those who are and who have missed that, to understand what I mean by that. That is destructive of life, and I mean that in its biggest theological sense. So life, physical life, human life, but non-human life as well. And it is a force for uncreation. And so that's another quite theological concept. We're not really going to be able to unpack that one tonight, but I just thought I'd throw that in there as well. Okay, so we've got a lot before us. I should let you know, I think I forgot to mention, there is no chance I will get through this tonight in 45 minutes, just giving you forewarning. So we'll take up a bit more time. We'll still have time for questions, I'm sure, at the end. So let's move on. So one thing there's little argument about at all is that the capitalist world system produces fantastic wealth, more than any other economic system in human history. And this chart of GDP per capita, looking at different regions of the world, from the birth of Christ up until the year 2001, tells the story very graphically. Tells you that up until about 1500, there was economic growth. What the thing we used to think about all the time was barely a thing. It barely happened. It happened very slowly. From 1500, it begins to become a noticeable thing. Then from 1800, something remarkable happens, and then that just keeps accelerating, particularly through the 20th century. So incredible story. And clearly it's been a differential story as well. Now, this graph, and this seems, when you put a graph like that, as often, it seems to tell a very simple moral story. If a graph of upward projection like that seems to tell a story of fantastic human benefit, and it's one of continual ascent as well, if you follow all of those graphs. We should be clear that this is a graph that is measuring gross domestic product per capita. Gross domestic product, I won't get into exactly, that's an economic way of measuring the whole economy in a particular area. So in this case, nations, or Africa is listed as a continent there, and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So it's a way of capturing the economy as a whole, and so it's aggregated figure, and then it's averaged for the population, and it's a monetary measure. So it's an aggregated, averaged monetary measure of what people have essentially earned. It's blind to a bunch of things, though. There's very many problems with this sort of economic data. Very simply, it's blind to distribution, doesn't tell us how the wealth is distributed. Doesn't tell us about the social and political conditions that sit behind that. And it doesn't tell us anything about non-monetary livelihood, which is a very big part of the story for most of the people in most of that history. So this graph is not history. It tells us something important, but a very simple thing. It really doesn't tell us much. It can lead us, it can be informative, or it could be very misleading, depending how the background we put it against. So let's just give now, I'm going to give a very quick Cook's tour, a brief history of global comparative living standards from 1500, well, let's say roughly to the present date, before I then start to think about how the capitalist world system plays into this story. So in 1500, this is a broad statement. There was not much substantial difference in the living standards of a Mayan peasant in Mesoamerica, an English copyholder, that's like sort of not a peasant, but a small farmer, a Ghanaian villager in the west coast of Africa, a Bengali artisan in India, and a Chinese rice farmer. There are differences between the quality of life of all of these, and differences in their social settings and things that would have impacted their lives, for sure. But really, at a material level, their living standards are not that huge a difference between them in historical terms. And when we're talking about living standards, we're talking about things like the amount of calories they eat, but also the quality of their nutrition. We're talking about their housing. We're talking about the amount of hours they have to work, the other life accoutrements they have in terms of clothing, utensils, things like that. By 1600, large parts of Meso and South America and West Africa experienced widespread deteriorations in quality of life. So there begins to be a substantial change in that picture. Over the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, India, China, and Japan all sustained significant population growth and moderate improvements in the case of China and Japan, or stable standards of living, as in the case of India. So that they were doing quite well over the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and remain quite comparable. I haven't said this here, but quite comparable to European living standards, at least for common folk anyway. And in Japan and China, wealth was much more evenly distributed than in Europe. From 1750, large parts of India begin to experience widespread deteriorations in quality of life. From 1840, large parts of China begin to experience widespread deteriorations in quality of life. From 1800, we begin to see what's often referred to as a great divergence between European GDP per capita, that's that economic measure, and East Asia. So up until now, there's been the GDP per capita of a European up until 1800 has been roughly equivalent to that of someone in Japan, China, or India. But from 1800, that begins to be very different. That's the averaged aggregated economic figure. From 1850, we begin to actually see widespread improvements in the standards of living of the European working classes or the common people. So that's a bit later from when we see that there's a time lag between the divergence of GDP per capita and widespread improvements for common people. During the 20th century, the great divergence between the West and the rest expands to colossal proportions, and it looks something like this. So this is the story of the 20th century, GDP per capita, showing the US, Australia, Japan, United Kingdom, Latin America, China, India, and Africa. By the year 2000, GDP per capita in the US is more than 20 times higher than that in Africa, which is sort of hard to get your mind around. So what happened? That's a very big story in world history. Something's going on there, and it doesn't really match the charts that we've seen before. So here's a different story of a different graph, which is a bit like the one I showed before. It's but just focusing on Great Britain from the years between 1000 AD to 1900. So from here, we're going to start to tell the story of the capitalist world system, and we'll start here in Britain, and we're going to check that story against what happens within the world system as a whole in relation to those living standards question. So as you can see, this chart as well seems to be one of continual ascent, things moving very slowly at the start, and then things beginning to pick up around about the mid 1400s and 1500, and then building up, and then that very sharp upturn around the period of the Industrial Revolution. Now, here's some spots I want you to pay attention to because they will become important soon. The year 1450 as an important mark, and you can begin to see that the line starts to turn up there. And the year 1650, there's also a faint increase in the upward turn, and then that period between 1750 to 1850 where there's a very sharp upward turn. Okay, hold those in mind, and let's look at our next graph. This is a graph that shows the real wages of an English carpenter as expressed in kilograms of wheat. So what that means is if you were to use his weekly wage and to go and buy wheat, how much wheat could you buy? How much wheat does it buy in that year, his weekly wage? And that's his real wages. And wheat is chosen here because it's the base staple food that people lived off. And so for an English carpenter, that it was for wheat. If you were in Scotland, you'd do this in oats, where that was their staple food. If you're in China, you'd do it in rice. So this tells you it's clearly a very select bit of information, but an important bit of information. Now, immediately you see that this graph is not one of continual ascent. So it's one in which it actually reaches its peak in 1450. That's in medieval times. Now, folks, you remember that's about the time I mentioned. So we've dated at the origins of the emergence of the capitalist world economy from the long 16th century, beginning roughly round about 1450. So these things are happening together. That's the peak of when 1450 European commoners, and this is across the board in Western Europe, not just for an English carpenter. If you were to do a blacksmith in Frankfurt or a cobbler in Paris, the chart looks something like this. The quality of standard of life is at its highest in 1450, and then it falls off a cliff over the next 200 years, just as a capitalist world economy is beginning to emerge. And it reaches its low point. So for this English carpenter, it's around 1650. It's a little bit different in different places in Europe, but it's somewhere in the 17th century generally. Then it begins to pick up again. And then we have another downward turn around about 1750 before it picks up again. But even by 1850, it's not anywhere near actually where it was in 1450. Now, that's a very different story from what we're not normally used to hearing about the continual advance in living standards. Now, I don't think this graph tells the whole truth. So I think there's more counting for the standards of living of a worker in 1850 than you can just express in their wages expressed as wheat. So there are other things that will improve that. But at least this graph gives us the very simple story that it was not just a simple continual ascent for so this is the English carpenter, but actually this graph holds true for pretty much the bulk of the common people in Western Europe. This is a very well-established fact of economic history, by the way. This is not something contentious, I'm saying. So let's note those spots again. So the turnaround point for the standards of living for the common people was 1450, right about the time a capitalist world economy comes into being. It hits its low point in 1650, then begins to rise again, but then turns down again in 1750. Now, all of those points, you notice, so there's an up and down here, but actually, if you remember the previous graph, at each of those 3 points signaled, there's only upward trends. In fact, the trends go sharper upward at each one of those points. So particularly if some people's lives are going backwards, and the bulk of the common people's lives are going backwards, while the GDP per capita, that's the averaged wealth, is going up, well, who's making that money? Well, it's very clear. It's not the common people. That means that the wealth is accruing not amongst the bulk of the people, but amongst the middle and the upper stratas of English society. And when we say middle, we're talking about the middle classes, not the middle segment of the population. So the middle and upper stratas at this time perhaps account for 20% of the population, whereas the rest account for 80% of the population. So basically, we're talking about an increasing polarization of society. Now, we're going to keep our little timeline of a little graph of British GDP per capita wealth, its continual ascent down in that bottom corner. Well, we now expanded our view beyond Britain to look at what was happening in the rest of the capitalist world system. We see things were not just straightforward for those who are right at the heart of it in Britain. So who won and who lost is not a simple story. What's happening for other people. So in 1492, right in the early stages of this story, the Spanish begins the conquest of the Americas and spurs a dramatic expansion of the European capitalist world system. And this event has huge impacts for the European economy, brings new land for exploitation, a new labor force, a flood of silver and gold, into a huge monetary injection into the European economy, and new crops, and the really critical ones will be maize and potato. They play an important role in the story. But of course, that comes at a massive cost. It comes originally through plunder of the crudest kind, enslavement, and it's generally thought, a literal demographic decimation of the Native Americans in both Incan, Mayan, and Aztec society. So we think in the period of the 16th century, that basically the population of Native Americans declined to 10%. So that's a loss of 90% to what it had been when Columbus first arrived in the Caribbean. Sort of hard to get your head around that too. In 1498, there's a further expansion. This all happens at once. This is all happening in historical terms, almost at the same instant. Europeans enter the Indian Ocean system. So Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Good Hope, the first European to do that, and begins opening up new opportunities for massive trading profits in the spices and textiles of the Indian Ocean. So we're talking about India and more especially the Indies, what we'd today call Indonesia, the Spice Isles. So in the Indian Ocean trade, that was funded by silver from America. One of the critical problems for the Europeans in dealing in East Asia and the Indies was that Europeans had nothing that they wanted to buy. So everything, we wanted to buy lots of stuff in East Asia and the Indies. I'm of European extract. Europeans wanted to buy lots of stuff, but had nothing they could sell, and so they needed silver, and that by immense stroke of good fortune, and they would have said they'd been blessed by God. They had all this silver that they were stripping out of the Americas. So with that, with them pouring silver into Asia, we begin to see the restructure of labor happening in the Spice Islands, in Malacca and in Java, and the move to supply this new huge demand coming from Europe. And we begin to see the development of plantation economies in those places. In the 16th century, next phase in the story, we begin to see the incorporation of Eastern Europe within the European capitalist world system. It's funny that South and Central America and even the Indian Ocean first get incorporated before Eastern Europe was, but that happens through the 16th century. So Eastern Europe, we're talking about the large areas of Poland, Lithuania, bits of Russia, Ukraine, begin to supply huge amounts of cheap grain, particularly to the Netherlands, which is the leading capitalist power at the time, and other parts of Western Europe. And that supply of cheap grain, the huge grain market from east to west in Europe, prompts what's historians call the second serfdom in Eastern Europe, or the re-feudalization of Eastern Europe. So after the bubonic plague in the 14th century in Europe, there was a period where basically most European peasants became freed from serfdom and became basically small farmers. But in Eastern Europe, it turned backwards back to serfdom in the 16th century, precisely to do with the demand that the nobles, aristocrats in Eastern Europe had if they were to supply the Western European market for grain, they needed to get a workforce. So in 1520, a Polish serf was compelled to supply only one day a week of work for his local lord. That's actually quite a lot. That was heavier than in most places in Europe, but you could live with that. By 1600, the compulsory labor that a Polish serf had to provide his lord amounted to 6 days per week, which is staggering. So it's just an immense burden. And as I said, so going back to what I said earlier in the night, this is supplying cheap grains for those Dutch laborers. Their access to cheap grain was dependent on what was happening to Polish serfs, and that's why we need a world system view of what was happening.
That's 40 minutes, John.
Thanks, Jacob. All right, let's press on with our story. Mid-16th century, we begin to see the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, an ominous moment in world history. So it's begun by the the Spanish and the Portuguese, but it's the Dutch who pioneer what's called the triangular trade, which is slaves from Africa grown to grow cotton, sugar, and tobacco grown in the Americas, which they then use to finance now the tea and spices that they want to buy in the East Indies that they're going to sell in the European market, and that's where they make their huge profits. And that enables the first mass consumer commodities in Western Europe: sugar, cocoa, tobacco, tea, very common things for us. So if you think of the quintessentially English drink, tea, a cup of tea, as being this thing at the center of English culture, well, actually, it is made up of a leaf from a plant that comes from China. It's, in the way the English drank it, mixed with sugar, which is a cane, which was sourced from Bengal in India, but then grown in the Caribbean by slaves from West Africa, and then mixed with milk, which in England came on unclosed land, which is what made the providing of retail dairy possible for urban populations in England. So the simple cup of tea, which became seen as a basic signifier of the quality of life of the English, has a global story to it. And there's a very big story of human suffering behind that. 15 million African slaves were sold into the Atlantic slave trade between the 16th century and mid-19th century. It's estimated that perhaps 2.5 million of them died in transit. And here's an image of what a slave ship looked like, how they packed slaves. This is, I think, from the 17th century. What's less known is that the trade in slaves from West Africa, mostly purchased often with guns, plunged West Africa into this destructive conflict that lasted for centuries of what I'm going to call pirate polities. Basically, these kingdoms who competed to gain slaves, to steal, basically to go and raid slaves from each other to sell to this huge European transatlantic slave market. And I would argue Africa is still living with the consequences of that today. All right, moving our story on. From the 17th century, we see the beginning of Western European settler colonialism in the Caribbean and North America. So by 1800, this settler colonialism is supplying what author Pomerantz has called ghost acres in supplying Britain. Basically, they're supplying land that Britain has to Britain because Britain doesn't have this land available. And if you measure it in terms of the sugar that they grow and the timber they provide and the cotton they provide, it amounts to around about 17 million extra acres for Britain. From 1750 to 1800, a crucial point in the story, the British East India Company conquers the Mughal Empire. I won't go into how that happened. Remarkable event when India became a massive nation run by a private company. So over this time and from this time onwards, Indian taxation and personnel fund Britain's war machine, its incredibly powerful navy that was able to project its power all over the globe. And that allowed to develop a war machine while still keeping domestic taxation in Britain quite low. So that has immediate quality of life consequences for the people back in Britain through how they're using India. They also use Indian opium to fund their trade with China. As I said, the Chinese don't want to buy any products from England, but they do want opium from India. It's in high demand. In the 19th century, the enforced deindustrialization of India, its textile industry, by the British, turns India from the world's largest exporter of textiles into the world's biggest market for Britain's new industrial textiles. And all of that comes at a huge quality of life cost for the Indian population. In the 19th century, we see the beginning of what's called explosive settler colonialism. So that's this is the boom in people crossing the seas to settle new lands. That really only happens in the 19th century from the Anglophone countries. And they're taking up land in North America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. That's what we are all a part of the story of. So this is by far and away the largest and most rapid land grab in human history. Basically, in this space, in the space of a century, less, English-speaking people take 2.5 continents, which is staggering. By 1850, the windfall of all this so quote-unquote free land is providing cheap food now for the workers of the industrial cities of Europe and North America. So this means this is increasing their real wages and standard of living. So if you remember, so it's right from the point I make at the beginning, it's only from 1850 that we see the common folk in countries like Britain, the workers, begin to see a gradual ongoing rise in their standards of living. And that begins from this point. Once this cheap food comes in from the settler colony lands, this is the thing that makes it possible. The settler societies had the highest living standards of all. So Australia had the highest GDP capita in the world between 1850 to 1900, and we're still up there amongst the highest. But of course, it was a cataclysm for Indigenous societies. And again, perhaps in Australia, worst of all. So we, again, in Australia, have the probable, we think the literal decimation of Aboriginal peoples over the course of the 18th century. So that is by the mid to late 18th century, the number of Aboriginal people on the continent is only 10% of what it would have been in 1788. And we've seen the extinction of many language groups. And of course, we are still living with the many effects of this cataclysm down in the present day. The story goes on, though. In the 1840s and 50s, we have the Opium Wars and gunboat diplomacy, which both forced China and Japan to open their borders to European trade and investment. And this is the last bastions of the non-capitalist economies of the world to fall. So it's at this point that really the European capitalist world system becomes a global world system, displacing all others. And this, of course, opens huge new markets for European industrial goods and capital. So they're investing particularly in railways and things like that. But in China, it plummets China into turmoil. Between 1800 and 1900, China moves from the world's wealthiest economy to becoming one of the poorest nations in the world on a per capita basis. Storage for Japan is quite different. Japan manages to industrialize and eventually come to challenge the West, but that's a different story. We won't come to that. Now, there's a very quick run through. I'm going to finish my history of the expanding capitalist world economy here. We could go on further. I haven't gone on. If we go on to the 1880s, there's the period of high imperialism and the rush for Africa of the European powers. But I think we've gotten to the point where the capitalist world system has basically covered the globe, and we've seen it chart. We've seen its expansion, and we've seen the ways that it's brought wealth back to the center in Europe, how those economies have expanded, and we've seen who it's meant quality of life improvements for and who it hasn't, and when those things have happened. I hope I've pointed to those things. So let's just have another moment to consider this quote from Deirdre McCloskey. "Let me earn profits from creative destruction in the first act, and by the third act, I will make all of you rich." So what Deirdre McCloskey calls, quite coolly, calls creative destruction in the first act is a story where we've really told the story of the first and second act. And while the term creative destruction sounds kind of entrepreneurial, I think from the story you've just heard, there's nothing very sexy or entrepreneurial about what we've heard. And it sort of shows you the, I guess, I can only say the moral outrage of a statement like this, in which you can talk about the things we've just, the history we've just encompassed as a first and second act, that by the third act will make all of you rich. And that's another interesting statement, by which I presume Deirdre McCloskey means this. This is what Deirdre McCloskey must mean by all of us rich. And then that's clearly a contentious subject. Now we're getting close. I'm going to finish up soon, but there's one I just want to point to. This is the story of the 20th century. There's we could say a lot about what happens in the 20th century. There's a big story there, but I'm just going to skip over the 20th century with that chart, because that tells a part of the story, and we'll end up in our present day, because I think we've got one more question I think it's important to answer. And I'll just say something quickly about this, and I'll point you to some more reading if you're interested in this subject. And that's the question of, well, that's all history, and you know, Deirdre McCloskey's first and second act, but we're in the third act now, and aren't we now at the end of poverty in the new millennium? You hear this less now, but actually this was a very strong line of argument in the first decade and a half of the new millennium, precisely the time of the Millennium Development Goals. So in the 2011 Independent Aid Review for Australia, that we have this quote: "By most measures, the world has seen unprecedented developmental success over the past 15 years. A lower proportion of the world's population now live in poverty than at any time in history." Well, that surely is a good thing. A lower proportion of the world's population now live in poverty at any time. Except we have to ask all sorts of questions. When you say poverty, what do you mean? And so what's very clear is what's meant is a monetary measure of poverty. And this is the graph on the right-hand side is from the World Bank. This is from the World Bank's global poverty counts that it alone of a world institution maintains, and showing the people who live on below US $1.90 a day. And you can see that the blue part, which is the poor, getting smaller. And that seems to be a simple moral story. I would love, we could spend a whole nother session just talking about the problems with this sort of statistics. If you read the essay, I'll point to you at the end. You can find out some of them, but I won't get into those tonight, other than to say it's there's, you know, what are they? So there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Well, this is a case in point. So let me point you to a smaller part of that story that I was able to see firsthand personally, which is what the happening over this period, what was the Mekong poverty success story. So just to take you back to this. So basically this is the basic argument is that through the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, so the fall of something that opposed capitalism, and the final triumph of capitalism, we have really the beginning, the ultimate triumph of globalization. That was the term used at the time, and the freedom, free market economies, and that's what's driving this change in poverty. So in Laos, there's the same sort of story happening. In the Mekong region. So when I say the Mekong, the Mekong region is made up of the nations of Cambodia, Laos, China, Vietnam, and Thailand. So I got to spend from 1995. I began doing a PhD on Laos, and then after that I began working for Oxfam, studying and visiting Laos all the way up to 2010. So between 1995 and 2010, I was watching this story, studying it and traveling and seeing it in firsthand human terms. So this is from figures from the Asian Development Bank. It says that the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day I'm just going to stick with Laos because that's my story, dropped in 1990 from 52% to 28% in 2003, in 13 years. That's a huge achievement. You can see why they're calling that a poverty success story. Seems to be a clear success. And so all the Mekong nations had rough growth rates during this time, around 6% per year, which, you know, any Australian government would kill for growth like that. Actually, they wouldn't, because that would drive inflation too high, probably. Yeah, huge economic growth. And it was lauded. So the Asian Development Bank promoted this, just like the World Bank promoted it, the World Poverty Success Story. This was very prominently talked about as a great success for globalization. This was precisely the time. So the 1990s was, so Cambodia, Laos, China, and Vietnam are all ex-communist nations. So the mid-1990s was the period when they opened up their borders to the West. So that's the point when we begin to see the capitalist world system, them to become integrated. So if you like, they were sort of around the edges of it, but from this time on, they become fully integrated within it. And it seems to be a poverty success story, except if you were on the ground in Laos and you were visiting villages, that story just didn't match up, as I was. I spent a lot of time researching and also visiting villages through Oxfam work and many of the partners that we worked with. And again, the story was the same. Life for a lot of people was getting harder. And here's the verdict of a very, very good report done in 2006, which basically mapped people's living standards in Laos over this same time period that the Asian Development Bank was promoting a poverty success story. And it said, compared to the year 2000, the original villages that we revisited in 2006 were generally found to be either about the same or worse off. The policy environment in the provinces where those villages were located had not changed noticeably. Access to land remains a major concern to villagers who view agricultural solutions as the only way to alleviate poverty. That was a pretty political way of saying they were losing their land and losing their forests and losing their rivers, all non-monetary parts of their mode of life. And they had more cash, that was undoubtable, but that counted a lot less to them than what they're losing in non-monetary things. And life was getting hard, and that continues to be the case in Laos today. So I have now talked for an hour and I need to finish, and don't get me started on inequality. There's a whole nother can of worms, a big story to be talked about there in this whole human story, and what we mean by inequality, how we measure it. There's all sorts of different confusing ways you can measure inequality, and you've perhaps heard confusing things about that. And also, we have not yet really talked about the global ecological crisis, which is an integral part of this whole story. We can't actually really tell this whole story properly without integrating it properly, but tonight we have run out of time. So I'm going to finish there. Oh, let me just point out, by the way, that report on the right-hand side is one that I wrote for Oxfam while I was on the hidden costs of economic transformation in the Mekong. You can download that for free from the Manna Gum website if you like. And while you're there, why not buy a hot dog? We are going to finish. If you want to read up some more of these things, and particularly if you're interested in the whole World Bank poverty account, the article in the middle there, The End of Poverty, is where I discuss that. So you can check out those links. I don't know if Jacob, I think they got pasted into the chat last time or something. But I am going to finish there. Phew! How have you gone? That was, I do apologize, but you know, it's done now.
Well done, John. And most of us, I think we actually gained people while you were talking rather than lost them.
Oh, wow. The word had got around.
Well, we'll kick off with Naomi. Naomi had a question right at the beginning about D.G. McCloskey. Do you want to ask that, Naomi?
Oh, it was more, if you don't specify these economists that you're referring to, and they're writing, are they generally people who have some kind of a faith or profess some kind of faith basis, or are they secular? Because
Well,
I assume that they're secular, but then I notice you say a lot of them actually have a faith background.
Well, John Atherton, two of those quotes were from theologians. John Atherton and Miroslav Volf are theologians. Deirdre McCloskey is an economist who has some faith affiliation, has actually written for a couple of Christian economist journals as well. Yeah, so she's part of the Episcopal Church in the US. It's not as, I won't speak for or vouch for what sort of faith Deirdre McCloskey has, but there's some sort of affiliation there.
Cool. Usual protocol, you can raise your physical hand, you can raise a Zoom hand. If it's silent, you can just unmute and go for it. Or if you'd like to get me to ask something, post in the chat. Claire Galvin, go for it.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was very nuanced, but I sometimes need to simplify things. Am I simplifying it too much if it kind of sounds like capitalism causes colonization? Would that be
great? Okay, great question. Certainly by the later stages, yes, their answer is unequivocal in that. So when we talk about the explosive settler colonization, I don't think there's any way you can understand that outside from the terms of an expanding capitalist world economy. That's what it is. That's what's going on there. People are going abroad to make money, or they're being pushed abroad because this life is so hard so in many cases in the UK, or being deported in the case of Australia because they're turned to crime, and that's all to do with what's happening in the capitalist world system. The question with the Spanish, there's a lot of debate about the role of the Spanish conquest with the Americas, because it's quite feudal the way they do it. It's barbaric. The Spanish aren't capitalists, but they are funded by the Genoese bankers. So the whole operation is funded by the Genoese, who are quintessential capitalists. So there's a big historical debate about that. There are strong links, but it's certainly tied into, whether it drives it or not, it's certainly tied into what is the beginnings of the capitalist world economy in strong ways. And thereafter, colonialism is really part of the story of capitalism. You cannot separate the two.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too, the link with colonialism. Any other questions? It's an open floor at the moment.
So, Jonathan, you mentioned that the English carpenter, their life improved once they were getting free food, or very cheap food from their class. Yes. But was that the only factor? Wasn't technology making them more productive and producing wealth that way?
So there are, I think there are other things. So by that stage, there are a bunch of things becoming cheaper for them. Things like tea and sugar, for example, these basic luxuries of tea, sugar, and cotton become cheap for them quite early on. And I've pointed out how that became cheap for them. But actually food becomes cheap for them later. That is the key point so up until that point, things remain quite hard if you want to, the Industrial Revolution is really complex, the social history of it, because there's all sorts of things happening. So it's hard to sort of reduce to simple stories. But I think if there is a simple story, for many or most of the people, life remains hard and uncertain and difficult, and the price of food is right at the center of that. And it's only once a supply of cheap food is secured for the urban industrial populations of Europe that living standards begin to rise across the board and in a continual ascent. So up until then, in the Industrial Revolution, things have been happening all over the place. There's boom and busts and things like that. But it's once cheap food comes in that we begin to see the beginning of what we see as modern Western living standards. And that's what that is what our living standards, I would still remain underpinned by. So the way we live today is underpinned by cheap food that we don't pay the true cost of of its production.
Now, we've got a question from Claire in the chat, but Bruce, were you about to ask one just before?
Well, I was, but Claire's got in ahead of me. I'm just typing it out. So,
Sure. Go for it, Claire.
I was just asking, Jonathan, you had it on your slide earlier about I can't remember the full quote now, but you mentioned uncreation and the Lords and whatever.
Yes.
And I've heard of other theologians talk about decreation. Are you meaning
Yes.
the same thing, or is there a different technical difference?
Yes, making up words to say something.
Okay.
But yes,
Cool.
so
Thank you.
the idea, and I think it's a really, it's a big theological concept that in creation, God is creating life and bringing it into an order and a set of relationships. So creation is made up of these things, made up of life, made up of order, and made up of relationships. And what we see capitalism doing is disintegrating relationships, order, and life, and the things that make for life, disintegrating those things like an acid bit by bit. And so I think it's helpful to theologically think of it as uncreation. And that's actually, I think, in an ecological sense, sort of true too.
Go for it, Bruce.
So I'm just wondering about the contrast that you put between the GDP and your own experience. And is the Mekong story typical? Are there useful research that seeks to measure improved or otherwise standards of living other than via GDP over that period?
Is that I was struggling to hear that. I'll find what you just.
I've written it. Yeah.
Is there seeks to measure improved or otherwise standards of living other than via G? Oh, so there is. I mean, there's lots of research into living standards. So the Human Development Indicators was a clear one. So that was brought out. So that measured, I think, human development. Anyone who knows this can jump in. Basically, education, life expectancy as well, and there's one other indicator there as well as GDP. Anyway, but more things like that, health and education. There's the Millennium Development Goals, which seek to provide. There are 7 different Millennium Development Goals. I'm not going to try and recall them off the top of my head, but these various indicators to measure quality of life. Now, I could tell you quite a complex story in Laos, where actually, over the same period that I've discussed, you see charted improvements against nearly all of the Millennium Development Goals. So these are things like access to clean water, access to a health facility, access to education. They all seem, these could seem quite rigorous, good ideas of ways of measuring. All of these happening in in a process of very significant coercive involuntary displacement of ethnic peoples that was having dramatic effects on the quality of life of ethnic. So it's a classic case study of how numbers can really mislead you if you don't know what you're looking at and you don't know the backstory. So numbers, I don't want to argue against them. I think they can be really helpful and important and powerful. But if you're not careful with them, they can also tell lies. So and that's the problem with the World Bank's world poverty headcount. The number is just absurd. The statistic and the way it produces it is just really, it's a smoke and mirrors method. But even trying to capture the complexity of what we might mean, like a world poverty headcount, is bonkers. When we're talking about so many different social, political, and economic contexts, the things you need to know to make any a reasonable judgment about what's going on for people in any one of those contexts that can't be captured in those numbers. So I'm for statistics and numbers, but I'm much more also for knowing real context and real stories of actual places and what's happening. And so I think my experience of what's happening in Laos, I know there's people who've had similar things in particularly in South Asia and also in Africa as well.
Thanks.
I tried to figure out how big 18 million acres are, those ghost acres, while you're talking, John, and it's
Yep.
a bit more than 2 times Germany, if you're trying
Really?
to visualize. Yeah.
Oh, that's bigger than I thought. Okay, that's big. Thanks.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was also wondering, I've heard the I don't know if objection's the right word for it, but I've heard people basically say the place we've got ourselves into at this point, the only solution is to do more of what we're doing because we've either our population's too big or the resources are so depleted or whatever it is that we can only go through. We can't sort of return to anything prior to this kind of exploitative, extractive system. What do we make of that sort of objection?
What we make of it is it needs to wait to the 6th session on
I thought that might be
post-capitalism. And it give me time to think about it. It is a really big question. It's obviously, one of the questions. So that will be the subject in the final session when we're thinking about imagining post-capitalism and what might it mean to. So maybe we'll take that as one thread to think about the through or the returning and what are those things.
Wouldn't that be the sunk cost fallacy, where you keep sinking costs in, hoping to change? I don't know.
Yeah, that would be one thing. Look, again, it's another, we're talking about really big stuff, so trying to wrap our heads around really big and complex ideas. But I'll take that on notice, Jack.
No worries. Any final questions? We're basically at time, but we've got room for one more, I think, if anyone's got a burning question. Oh, we've got one from Brendan Petty. Did you want me to ask that, Brendan? I think I'll ask it. He says, $1.90 US still seems pretty low, a low poverty bar to my experience of living. Does it adjust with inflation? Is the story different if non-poverty were a little more pleasant?
It does adjust with inflation, but it's the way you arrive at that figure from one country to another is incredibly dodgy. And it is very low. And so it's the whole question around, so there's this whole idea of absolute poverty, and that's the thing we should be worried about. Actually, I would argue that it's not a meaningless concept, but actually poverty as an entirely relational context, and people's experience of poverty depends on what they're seeing around them. So the bigger question is inequality, actually. And so I actually saw this happen in Laos. People who in 1995 were right near the bottom of the world standard GDP per capita, that's considered amongst the poorest people, but who lots of people in their particular ethnic languages didn't have a word for poverty and didn't consider themselves poor. By 2010, which is my last visit to Laos, those people considered themselves poor very clearly, and they saw themselves in relation to Thailand and China, and they saw themselves in relation to what they're seeing on TV sets to the West, and they understood themselves in relation to a picture they didn't have before, and that changed their whole view about their mode of living. So poverty is a relational concept. I'm not saying the concept of absolute poverty is meaningless, and I don't think I'm even answering your question now. Sorry, Brendan, I've just gone on a rant, which is, sorry, that's my tendency. But the figure is pretty great. Look, I think that the whole idea of an absolute poverty world headcount is silly. And check out that article in Manna Matters if you want to read a bit more on how those figures are arrived at. Well, thanks once again, folks, for your patience. So next week we move on to, we really take a big change in tack from, we've done massive big picture of history and across the world tonight. To next time we gather, we're going to think completely reverse that in. We're going to think about our own context in the present historical moment, what it means to think about Christian witness in Australia. So that's where I'm talking from. I think this will apply pretty strongly for New Zealand as well. I feel fairly confident about that. Yeah, big change in tack, and hopefully we'll see you then here in a fortnight. See you, folks.